Disinformation knows no borders, and today the stakes seem higher than ever. Welcome to Truth Talks, a brave new podcast series tackling the challenges of fake news and propaganda head-on. Join us for engaging short conversations with experts from all EU member states and Ukraine as we uncover the truth behind dominant disinformation trends and explore the strategies shaping Europe's fight against manipulation. In this episode, we are zooming in on Ireland. Our guest today is Dr. Eileen Culloty, Deputy Director of the Institute for Media, Democracy and Society at Dublin City University. She coordinates the Ireland hub of the European Digital Media Observatory. Welcome to Truth Talks.
Hello.
Hi. As a digitally connected nation with a strong media landscape, Ireland is not immune to disinformation. What are the dominant disinformation narratives circulating in Ireland?
Well, it can change in response to what's happening in the world, but broadly, there's a very strong anti-migrant narrative. And this has been consistent now for a number of years. It's often quite influenced by narratives that you find in the US or the UK, because as a small English-speaking country, we're very influenced by that. And that has a lot of undertones of Islamophobia to it as well. And then recently, because of the news around the US actions towards Ukraine, there's a narrative around Ukraine about maybe that it's NATO's fault. And I mean, that's always been there as well, perhaps more associated with people in certain sections of the left. And that's becoming topical in Ireland because this issue around Irish neutrality and Ireland's lack of funding for the defence forces becoming a really, really pointed conversation. And then there's general I think, health disinformation never fully goes away, and conspiracy theories. Whatever is getting traction, I think, in the US, it makes it here eventually.
It would be great also to use this podcast somehow like a means to understand the internal situation of the countries we are discussing. So you mentioned the Irish neutrality. So what are the major disinformation, misinformation trends within this topical scope?
I'm almost slow to say that it's disinformation because fundamentally there's a lot of ideological disagreement. So Ireland has always been a neutral country, but it's kind of questionable about how Ireland defines neutrality. And there are a number of different issues integrated. One is that our spending on the defence forces is just shockingly low. We're very poorly placed to defend our own waters. And we also have a lot of undersea cables that travel through Irish waters. So there's this one issue around increasing defence spending. And that often then gets kind of mixed in or confused with this issue around maintaining Irish neutrality. So it's a very tricky conversation. And I think as we find with a lot of these things, we have to be very careful about not accusing everyone of disinformation. Sometimes it's the people have their own ideological positions, which they're perfectly entitled to, and that's what democratic debate is. Sometimes people perhaps leave out important context to their arguments. And then sometimes it is just people making false claims. Whether they truly believe it or not is unclear. So I think that's probably going to be one of the more trickier issues for Ireland going into the future, because there's very strong support for neutrality. And yet we know, as we're now one of the few European countries that is neutral, we're outside of NATO, there's almost no real support for Ireland joining NATO. I don't think NATO would want us because our military is so poorly funded. And then the question, I think, will be whether there will be any efforts to kind of influence that debate in Ireland. So up until now, a lot of the disinformation narratives around migration or health, I think, have been fairly uncontroversial for Irish politics to navigate. This neutrality and defence funding issue is going to be much trickier.
And it's interesting because I'm aiming to ask you about the major disinformation producing and spreading actors. Who might be benefiting from spreading disinformation about the neutrality? I understand that it's anti-neutrality more.
No, I think there's just a lot of competing narratives about what neutrality is and what it should be and the dangers. So at the moment, Ireland can't deploy peacekeeping troops unless there is a mandate from the UN Security Council, and the government wants to replace that and say, well, the Security Council isn't functioning. And that in itself is viewed as being a threat to neutrality. So it's just that it's a very emotive issue, something that people have very strong feelings on. And I think this is something, again, where people involved in analyzing disinformation have to be very careful that you do not label everything as disinformation and I think it's a good example of where promoting accurate information is really important, or pointing out where context is missing, but allowing debate to occur.
Mm-hmm. And what would you name as the most widespread fake news today in Ireland?
Well, this week I'm not sure. There's so much anti-migrant disinformation that just gets circled around again and again. Because it's been in the news, there's been a lot this week about this idea that NATO started the war in Ukraine. And again, they come from two very different sides. One would be associated with more actors on the left, and then the other with actors on the right. I don't know that there's huge traction for the whole arguments about NATO and the war in Ukraine. I don't think that filters down to the level of ordinary people, whereas the anti-migrant narratives very much circle down. And those are the ones where you find actors in Ireland promoting these stories, going around like vigilantes, filming migrants and asking them what they're doing here. And then their videos being retweeted and shared by people in the US or in the UK, including all the way up to people like Elon Musk.
So you already started answering the question that I also already introduced that would appear about the major actors. You mentioned now the most, I understand it, politicians on the right and left, yes, political forces. Did you mean that?
Well, the anti-immigrant actors, they're quite fringe political. Like, we don't have a strong far right presence politically, and we don't have a strong history of that. So these are quite fringe political entities. They ran in local elections last year and they won some seats. They didn't really have any presence in the national elections last November. But what they've been very successful at is going into communities where there are centres to house asylum seekers and to stir up lots of protest in those communities. Those protests have died down. They were very prominent throughout much of last year, and they've started to die down. But it's that intersection of these Irish actors with the American and British, I think that's most concerning. And particularly when you have someone with the power and influence of Elon Musk, who shares stories about Ireland, falling to migrants or intervening in proposals to have hate speech laws. That's just a different level to maybe some of the stuff that you see around health or NATO.
So when you are mentioning this fringe kind of actors, is it like they dump a narrative on the fringes and then look if and as it gains traction, and it's from the fringes, it's gaining traction towards the mainstream? Is it the way the disinformation narratives develop?
Well, it's because they're very much tied to offline protests, so protests within communities. And this has been building for a few years. So in the years prior to COVID, there would be protests around if a hotel was being turned into a centre to host migrants or asylum seekers, there would be some protests outside. Some were burnt down. But those protests were small enough. And then post-COVID, that has just escalated to large-scale protests and arson attacks. So the disinformation element is very much tied into to activism. And we also see on YouTube, there are videos that are never taken down of people putting up roadblocks and not allowing non-white people to walk down the street past these roadblocks. There are videos of people going around with balaclavas saying that they're watching out for migrants and patrolling their communities. So this is, one of the issues with disinformation is that we focus on content. What's concerning here are people taking action and being out on the ground within communities and turning to violence and arson.
How vulnerable do you find the Irish society is to disinformation?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's interesting because we don't really know. On the one hand, one of the issues is that we don't have, I think, a long history of this type of activity. So people weren't entirely sure how to deal with it. So when we saw these types of groups emerging and these protests, there was a very hands-off approach. It was kind of dismissed as well. They're not gaining much traction in politics, so maybe it will just go away. And perhaps that misunderstands the nature of the media world that we now live in. So, for example, a few years ago, when the protests started happening in American libraries around books, so-called, propaganda books that were really just about LGBT identity, that was happening in the US. And then within a few weeks, there were people going into Irish libraries and taking books off and intimidating librarians. And I think that really took people by surprise, the speed at which something began in the US and then was manifesting here. So I don't think we can answer that question very easily because it's really unpredictable about there are now just huge segments of people that are intensely plugged into other media worlds. And we saw that during COVID with like crazy protests, people endorsing all kinds of just mad conspiracy theories that they were reading about online.
Okay, coming back to the actors. So you mentioned the fringes, you mentioned the local Irish fringe political activists. You mentioned the UK and US. How would you describe the types of activities that come from different directions? And are there any other actors? Because, for example, Russia is a recurrent actor in my podcast talks.
Yeah, this is something that comes out a lot across the EDMO network, where many countries, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, Russia is such a major force in the disinformation narratives. I think in Ireland, just because where we're positioned so far out in the West as a small island, the influence of English-speaking actors from America and the UK is just much stronger. I mean, there is evidence of there are figures within Ireland that would certainly have a significant profile and would repeat a lot of Russian talking points. And there was evidence last year of I think it was part of a French investigation into Russian-backed sites, and one of them was in the Irish language, which seemed kind of peculiar.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not to the same depth that you would find in other countries. So I wouldn't say that there's no influence there at all, but the influences maybe from English-speaking countries at the moment is much more notable.
Fascinating, and it brings me to another question, although in a way I'm hearing the answer already. That is about the unique character, the specificity of the disinformation landscape of Ireland.
And I would think it is very much the English-speaking influence. I mean, when you're a small country as well, people in Ireland consume just large amounts of media that were created for Britain or for the US. And you can hear it in the way people talk about things. It influences the way people understand politics, or misunderstand politics, I should say. A very obvious one will be something like free speech, which is just this rallying cry now of the right in the US. But in Ireland, and in Europe in general, we just do not have this American concept of free speech. And then it becomes quite hard to have normal conversations about how we should govern our society, about how we should govern social media, when one of the most powerful men in the world is tweeting constantly in English and will pick on a country like Ireland and say, they're rolling back on free speech. And then you get these pylons. There was just this week a journalist from the Irish Times published a piece on Irish figures that appear to interact quite a lot with Elon Musk. So these are people, some of them quite extremist individuals. And then Elon Musk retweeted it. And then there was this kind of pile-on to get this article removed. So something simple in Ireland, something as simple as an Irish journalist reporting who are the Irish people who appear to influence Elon Musk, can lead to this massive backlash from all these American fanboys.
And you are surrounded, as you are saying, as a unique characteristic by this non-EU actors. That is the UK from on the one side, and after the ocean there is the US. So do you have a lot of anti-EU disinformation like we do on the continent?
There's definitely anti-EU disinformation, but Ireland has, I think, consistently in Eurobarometers, Ireland would have some of the highest levels of support for the EU, and
Exactly as we in Poland, but
Very good.
still.
And in a way, in Britain, that anti-EU sentiment in Britain and the media's anti-EU rhetoric for decades was just so ridiculous. I think that allowed Irish people to just see it for what it is. And Ireland, being member of the EU, has been very good for Ireland. So there were some like Irexit parties. They were generally treated as being kind of quite stupid. Which doesn't mean that Ireland agrees with everything the EU does, of course. And again, this neutrality and defence spending issue, I think, is going to be one of the bigger challenges for the Irish-EU relationship.
So let's turn to the final anti-doom and gloom question. What's being done to counter disinformation in Ireland, and what more would you recommend?
It's a really hard one, because whenever anything is done to counter disinformation, it gets accused of being censorship. So you just have to be very careful and always making that point about the lines between censorship and just countering disinformation isn't censorship. There is a national counter-disinformation strategy which was set up and will be due to report its strategy. And what was interesting about that was it pulled together different government departments, but also different civil society groups. So I was part of it, representing EDMO and academia. The Press Council were part of it. Media literacy organizations, technology companies were all invited to be part of it. There's a lot of work on media literacy. I think that would be a big strength in Ireland. We have a very good national media literacy network. The libraries are really getting involved, and schools. And then fact-checking is something, and the news media I think Irish news media are quite good overall, but there's that whole issue about funding fact-checking and funding news media in general, particularly as they come under more pressure. And then I guess another huge one with disinformation is that whole research piece, and the fact that there's a lot we just don't know about what's going on in online platforms. And the platforms have failed to give data, just kind of refused or just held up every initiative that was meant to access data. And now under the DSA, there's supposed to be an opportunity to access data. And a lot of that is being done in Ireland because of the companies being based here. So in a very roundabout way, I would say there's a lot going on from different sectors. But from an Irish point of view, and I think from an EU point of view, one of the most important things with Ireland is we are the country that homes a lot of these tech companies. These tech companies have generally failed to live up to their side of the bargain on schemes like the Code of Practice on Disinformation. A lot of the information they provided has been largely useless. And I think there's a point at which, where is Ireland going to fall? Is it going to side with the EU and crack down on these companies and put pressure on them? Or is it going to do what it has historically done and try and take the side of the companies?
Thank you. Very important job ahead of Ireland. Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of our conversation about the Irish disinformation landscape. Thank you for shedding the light on these important issues.
Thank you very much.
Truth Talk series is part of the project Guardians of Truth, fact-checking during Poland's EU presidency, which is supported by European Media and Information Fund, managed by Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation.